light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I just wanted to offer a few thoughts and reflections on distinctions and transitions between superficiality and depth. It does seem that an awful lot of people in the world prefer things to be very superficial. I suppose in some sense that might be because we're afraid of each other. We're afraid of rejection, afraid of disapproval. And yet if we regard relationships as the greatest place in which to demonstrate the golden rule, that basic idea of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that is found in some form in basically every religious or philosophical belief system in human history. There's some sense in which every one of them agrees that what you put out comes back, garbage in, garbage out. What you sow, you reap, etc. There's in looking at superficiality in societal relationships, if what we put out is trust, we would like to think that what we will get back is trust. Obviously, human history has lots of examples in which people didn't respond with trust. And in fact, most of the laws that have been written have something to do with a trust that was violated. The problem becomes that even while we write the law to safeguard the trust in that area, the fact that we even have to write the law in the first place, which I guess we don't have to, but the fact that we do is like an affirmation that from that point on we won't trust, or we take the trust out of ourselves and put it in the law, so that it is not we who trust, but the law who holds somebody accountable. Accountability, after all, is the corollary to trust. That if there's accountability, there can be trust, and if there's no accountability, there probably shouldn't be trust. Bringing this to superficiality and depth, however, is where it becomes a little complicated, deciding how much can we trust if there is not accountability, if there is no reason of accountability for someone to be honest with me. How much can I still trust them to give me an honest answer if I, in a sense, don't hold anything over them? To reduce accountability to the idea of holding somebody else's leash in some metaphorical sense, however, kind of robs the trust of its genuineness. It's not so much that we create accountability first and then put trust, as that, in my understanding, we extend the trust in a way that acknowledges or that recognizes there is accountability. That I am trusting you, but if you choose to dishonor that trust, negative consequences will occur. Bringing this back to superficiality and depth, though, the point where we kind of took off on this tangent was being afraid of being open and honest with each other. We're being superficial with each other because we're afraid to be deep. People, and I'm generalizing here, of course, for the sake of conversation, because every individual circumstance does this or doesn't do it to varying degrees. It would be like sharing something very personal with someone and having them report it in a negative fashion to someone else so that it becomes a form of sabotage. That in a moment of emotional weakness, you turn to somebody for compassion, and in the moment they may express compassion, but then they go and blab the story to people who don't have the maturity to bear it, and those people in turn tell somebody else until everybody knows, and they're laughing at our foolishness instead of demonstrating the same compassion that we experienced when we first shared whatever it was. To respond to that by becoming more superficial and more hesitant and more aloof, however, sabotages all future relationships that could have otherwise occurred. Somehow we have to get back to saying trust needs to be reestablished. I think we all understand what betrayal is. What we can't always figure out is how to heal betrayal and reestablish trust. And so I guess all of this is to say, I think I understand to some extent what the problem is. The reality that seems to run parallel to all this, however, is that relationships that do accomplish depth have incredible strength, especially in times of crisis, but all the rest of the time as well. When we established a relationship of depth, even the deepest relationships, there may be a betrayal that sabotages it. But in all the times when the betrayal isn't happening, there is an intensity and a collaboration and a power, if you will, that follows that mutual respect and mutual support that carries all participants much further than they would have ever been otherwise able to go. When we don't have the depth, it makes a whole lot of problems 10 times more difficult to address. If we have, to use the common witticism of the elephant in the living room, when there is a problem, be it an addiction such as alcoholism or an event that somebody doesn't want the other person to find out because they might not like them or they might not approve or they might be upset or whatever. When there's an elephant of any kind in the living room, something which you won't talk about and you're tiptoeing around it, but everybody else knows it's there, and meanwhile it's making a mess out of your living room and destroying your life. It seems to me that if you have depth, there can be that openness and honesty that allows you to effectively address the elephant. If you don't have the depth, you find yourself with a challenge for which you don't have the resources to solve. You don't have the necessary resources. It's like having an elephant without having a doorway out of the room big enough for an elephant to get out. It's like having a screw that needs to be put into a board, but you have a flat screwdriver and the screw has a Phillips head, a crosswise a four-way cross head on it. So you don't have the right screwdriver, you can't move the screw at all. Like having a nail, because you want to hang a picture on the wall, but you don't have a hammer. So how do you get the nail in the wall to hang the picture? There's a disconnect, and superficiality in general has far fewer tools to deal with the challenges of life than depth has. When we go into depth, when we're willing to be open about ourselves, we create additional opportunities for depth in other people. We create additional opportunities for depth within the whole community. When the whole community can recognize that there is a problem, for example, the AIDS epidemic, when the whole GLBT population recognized that there was a common adversary, a collective problem, and they were willing to address this collectively. They found, first of all, that it meant going to depth. It meant dealing with their own difficult emotions. It meant dealing with the difficult emotions of people who were being diagnosed with, the first cases of AIDS and HIV, that there were people dying and we didn't know why. And then there was a time where people were afraid to touch each other, and everything became very superficial because people were afraid. And even in that time, though, those perhaps few people who were willing to say, in spite of the fear, this person needs to be loved. And they need to be loved for who they are, without judgment, without condemnation, without any sort of religious or political agenda. Simply loved as a person unconditionally. And by taking that depth and rising up as a community and engaging that depth and being willing to be deep and open with each other, the response that came out to the AIDS epidemic was positively astonishing. For the first 8 years of the AIDS epidemic, the president of this country would not even speak the word. He didn't actually say the word AIDS until he was out of office. During that time, hundreds of thousands of people were dying. If this had involved any other population other than the GLBT population, I seriously doubt it would have been so ignored. Initially, there were so many of the victims were gay men that it was almost referred to as being a gay plague, which of course it wasn't. Diseases don't care about orientation, race, gender, anything. They're simply diseases. They attack human bodies regardless of description. They're totally non-discriminatory. So those who wanted to deal with it superficially, of course, were busy playing elephant in the living room. It's unpleasant, we don't want to talk about it. Those who were willing to address it deeply discovered forms and demonstrations of love that were positively awe-inspiring. And we'll probably be writing stories about them for quite a number of years to come. In being willing to address the depth of the event and the truth of the event and who was being affected and how fast, how quickly, and how tragically, and being willing to open themselves to the depth, people found themselves collaborators in fighting something bigger than any of us, bigger even than our country. Because AIDS exists all around the world now, AIDS and HIV. And there were all sorts of things for medical science that would not have been discovered except for the adversary of AIDS. Even as we're bringing good things out of it, though, those good things came out of looking deeply, not of being superficial. There's a sense in which being superficial feels safe, looks nice, maybe even be comfortable, may allow you to smile and be happy in a light, superficial sort of sense. But all the people I have observed who have taken that route have wound up relationally bankrupt. When you shrink back from loving someone deeply, from listening to someone with an open heart and an open mind without judgment, when you pull away from those things, you deprive yourself of empowering relationships. You cling to the superficiality and choose to go water skiing, if you'll allow that metaphor, instead of deep sea diving. But only the deep sea divers understand that there's a chest full of treasure at the bottom of the lake or the ocean or whatever body of water. That there are wonders and a whole nother world of fascinating colors and forms and different ways of being and doing life that exist in depth, that do not exist in superficiality and that can never be seen in superficiality. And if we are living our lives superficially, water skiing the whole way through, we get to the end, and the whole reason Henry David Thoreau went to Walden was specifically because he didn't want to water ski through life and get to the end and discover that he had never really lived. He wanted to really ponder life and seek out what it is and know it for what it is, in all of its beauty and in all of its tragedy. And in so doing, he wound up creating a life that was giant in comparison to every superficial person around him. But we could all be giants. We could all be angels and magical wizards and so forth by opening ourselves to the depth and richness of who and what we are. So much of what we learn we find in others, but the more that I learn from others, the more I find echoes of all these same things within myself. And the more I find those echoes with myself, the more I'm able to give more of who and what I am in service to the world around me. there are some people who say that the makeup I wear as Sister Who is a sort of mask that conceals who I truly am. The only reason they say that, however, is because they only see the superficial exterior. What they don't see is the depth and the meaning behind it. And when I begin to bring that out and explain to them what each symbol means, and that every detail of the costume and makeup of the ritual garb, every detail has symbolism behind it. And as I begin to explain these symbols, then when they look at Sister Who, they begin to be impressed at how this enlightens their own aspects of being and things about themselves that they never noticed before. I once during my master's program, getting my master's in theological studies, I took a class on different forms of prayer. And as part of that, we were assigned the task of facilitating a mini workshop of sorts for just half an hour with a small group of our classmates, instructing them in some alternative way of praying. Discovering in this whole process that we came up with 20 or 30 different ways that one could pray. 20 or 30 different ways that one could put positive intention and positive thoughts and loving energy and wisdom and communication with the divine into some action or thing or attitude, be it internal or external. For some it was closing your eyes and meditating, and by focusing your thoughts in a specific way, creating a connection with the transcendent. For others, it was everything from stringing beads in a particular order, paying attention to color and shape and texture, to using songs in a repetitive, meditative sort of fashion. For myself, I chose to embrace the assignment through face painting. And so I instructed a small number of my classmates in how, in applying face paint as Sister Who, there are prayers that are associated with each detail as I apply it. That as I draw a vertical line to begin the whole process, it is specifically invoking, specifically requesting that the ultimate wisdom and love of the divine flow through me, through this manifestation, through this form, so that asking that I may be an effective servant to others' personal and spiritual growth, whenever and ever, always, when I'm in ritual garb as Sister Who. That as I paint the purple on into its respective areas, that the color purple will remind me to be a balance point between masculine and feminine, and to remember that Sister Who is neither and both at the same time. That Sister Who is not about gender orientation as much as Sister Who is a deeper level of personhood that precedes questions of gender and orientation. That you have to be a who before you can be a he or she, and you have to be he or she before you can be gay or straight. It's a sequential sort of development. But all of this is depth. It's not superficiality. If you were going to look at Sister Who with pure superficiality, you would probably note the placement of color and symbol, but superficiality by its nature cannot ask, what does this mean? Because the minute you ask, what does this mean, you're moving into areas of depth. But it is in the depth, I believe, where the greatest riches are to be found. It's when you reach beyond what you merely see and touch and feel and taste to the non-material realities of the soul, that ultimately life is about the growth of the soul, and that when I put the makeup on, because these are symbols and colors and meanings that are part of my soul, there is a sense in which, in being Sister Who, what you see is my real face. It is not a mask I simply hold in front of my face, but it is my real face, but it is ornamented and decorated in such a way that the deeper meanings that would otherwise be invisible now become visible, and that commitments to peace and to growth and to life and to integrating both the surprise and the happiness and the tragedy in life, that somehow all of these diverse things mixed together to form a wholeness that none of them could create in and of themselves. It is not one symbol in and of itself that defines all of who and what Sister Who is, but it is all the symbols taken together. And symbols by their very nature cannot be superficial. A superficial symbol will be a symbol that is not understood. In order to understand what any symbol means, you have to immediately ask, what does this mean? And now we're in the realm of depth again. So it puzzles me, all that being considered, it puzzles me somewhat when I run into people who want to keep things superficial. And I have to wonder if maybe they consider the depth too much work, or maybe they saw something in some moment of exploring the depth of their being that frightened them. And instead of going back for more conversation, to instead draw away from it and try to hide from it. But ultimately we can't hide from ourselves. You can run from yourself your whole life and never get around to discovering it, and all you will do is impoverish yourself in the process. I was doing a photo shoot with a friend several years ago, and we went to a popular city park to take a picture down by the stream there, and there was a bunch of children there, and there was a young, very intelligent young lady who looked to be maybe 11, and she saw me and said, "Ooh, that looks frightening." And I said, "What's frightening about it?" And she said, well, at first she said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, when you feel afraid, it's really just the prompting to ask a question. It's something in you that says, I need more information. So what part of what you see is most frightening?" And so at that point she thought a moment and said, "Well, okay, how about the purple on your face?" So I explained it as the balance point between masculine and feminine, that there is the active and the passive, the nurturing and the organizational, the masculine and the feminine within each of us, and these need to be integrated and balanced and brought to bear on our particular life challenges. And that furthermore, in the case of my face, I had specifically drawn it from top to bottom and side to side to show that we live at the intersection of our vertical and horizontal relationships. And further, I had tipped it so that one eye is framed in purple and the other in white, to show that there is always more than one way of looking at things, and that what we see often has more to do with what surrounds us than with what surrounds the thing at which we're looking. None of which, of course, is superficial, because I'm getting into depth and what does this mean, and why is it the way it is, and how is it interpreted, all of which are matters of depth. And after sharing all that with her, I asked her again, "So how do you feel now? Are you still afraid?" And she thought a moment and said, "No, I'm not." I said, "See, so next time you feel afraid, ask a question, because it's your inner conscience prompting you to say, I need more information." And even if what they say is offensive or threatening or whatever, if they want to present a perspective or an argument saying, "You have to believe like me," well, actually I don't. I get to believe whatever I choose to believe. And if they say, well, this is why, I can still come back without even getting alarmed about it and say, "Well, I don't find your statements convincing. You have suggested this as evidence, and I'm saying, for me anyway, it's inadequate evidence. I'm not convinced." Which basically says to the other person, if you can't present it to me with a depth that involves truth and love and wisdom and something greater than you and I'm under no requirement whatsoever to believe it. And even if you do present it that way, I still have the freedom of choice. But it raises the standard somewhat, and I hope through all the discussion of the last half hour that this brings out how there is a richness and an empowerment in depth that doesn't depend upon being afraid. It depends upon being open and being willing to risk trusting. And that if someone has demonstrated a lack of trustworthiness, if they are willing to talk about it, if they are willing to own the fact that they have been untrustworthy, that in and of itself could be an opportunity to build a better relationship. If someone is entrenching themselves in superficiality and refusing to deal with what does this mean, why, how am I to interpret this, if they're refusing to deal with those things, either because they're afraid of what they might find or afraid of what they have found in the past, it severs the relationship, and both people are disempowered by that. Nevertheless, no matter how many times that has happened, none of that means it has to continue happening. At any point we choose, we can move beyond superficiality, and instead of saying, "Hi, how are you?" but I really don't want to know, we can say, "Hi, how are you? And I intend to take the time to listen." Or if we don't want to know, we can simply say, "Good morning, I wish you well today." And we don't have to ask a question that we don't want answered. We can hold ourselves to a standard of truth and integrity that opens the door for mutually empowering collaboration. In any case, thank you very much for watching. I know we've only scratched the surface because we never get to say everything that needs to be said on any subject in these shows. But I thank you for watching, and I'll leave you with this blessing. Now may you be blessed with love and peace in the pursuit of your own dreams and in all your dealings with the diversity of humanity around you.